the recent release of Ready or Not, I thought it'd be a good time to look back at its spiritual predecessor, SWAT 4. SWAT 4 was developed by Irrational Games and published in 2005 by Sierra Entertainment. Irrational developed this in what was basically the middle of their winning streak, having co-developed System Shock 2 a few years prior, and releasing BioShock not long after this game came out. SWAT 4 is actually the 9th installment in the Police Quest series, stretching all the way back to when Sierra Online dominated the point-and-click adventure genre. SWAT 4 is only very loosely connected to Police Quest, however. If you get SWAT 4 today, you'll likely be getting the SWAT 4 Gold Edition, which comes bundled with its expansion, the Stechkov Syndicate. The expansion added plenty of new features, new missions, and a ton of new bugs. So if you're going to get SWAT 4, you might as well go all the way and install the Elite Force mod. Elite Force is a pretty comprehensive mod that ties everything into one campaign, as well as adding some new features of its own and adding some quality of life improvements. It also gets rid of a lot of bugs that the Syndicate added. I'd easily recommend it, even if you've never played SWAT 4 before. In case it wasn't obvious, all of my footage is going to be using this mod, so don't expect this to be the most vanilla review or whatever. One last thing, this game doesn't really have a storyline as most of the missions are self-contained, and I'm probably going to be spoiling the more interesting parts of some of these missions. Just a heads up. With all that out of the way, let's get started.
You know, I took a girl on a date here once.
Must have been a blind date.
A lot of the graphics are really well done, although some of them are just okay. Starting with what's good, I think the environments clear everything else by miles. There's a lot of great detail, there's a ton of variety, and it's some really well done environmental storytelling. Even if there are a repeat of archetypes like dirty apartment building, they still mix it up. The environmental design isn't just there to look pretty either. The design of the rooms means that enemies can get a jump on you if you aren't paying attention, and there's a lot of importance placed on knowing the map layout. If you aren't very attentive, you'll find yourself becoming very familiar with the room layouts. Random enemy placement means that just memorizing enemy positions won't help you out either. Going back to the look of the environments themselves, they remind me a lot of the immersive sims from around that time, like Thief 1 and Deus Ex, especially with how dark and gritty some of the maps are, and how it's perpetually nighttime outside. Of course, this feeling isn't really surprising given the company's history. And just like Deus Ex and Thief, one of the weaker aspects of the graphics are definitely the character models. Everyone kinda looks the same, and that's doubly true for the faces. I mean, the same 911 caller face is used in 2 separate missions back to back. Maybe they're twins or something, I don't know. It's not so bad that there's multiple reused faces in the same mission or anything. At least not that I have evidence of. But it's obvious the focus wasn't on the characters. I don't want to show off too much more because of how tightly the storytelling is weaved in with the environments, but overall, I only have a few minor nitpicks with the graphics. In a game like this, it's important that the visual clarity holds up under scrutiny, and in this case, I think it does. There's a lot of detail in just about everything, but not so much that you'll be overwhelmed. It all comes together to bring this really gritty atmosphere to the game, although visuals are only half of the equation. Audio brings a lot to the table, probably even more so than the graphics. And that's doubly true for the voice acting. The voice acting is top-notch, and even though some of the actors get recycled, they bring a lot of character to the characters. The SWAT team in particular is amazing, and even includes Nolan North early in his career. Like I showed earlier, they'll even quip at each other at certain parts of the level.
Just a little white powder. It's okay. I give up. It's just a little powder, okay?
Roger that. Standing by for further reports.
911 emergency, 107, hello?
There's a woman with a gun at the gas station. I think there was a gunshot. But I drove away.
What's the address?
Help me.
Yo, Fields, I'm waiting for you to come up with some smart-ass comment.
There's nothing funny about this. You got that right.
I don't know what else to say. It's all just so good. Well, okay, maybe it's a little campy. Looking at the music, it all sounds thematic and appropriate for the levels they're in. I couldn't tell you what any one track sounds like, but it all has that early 2000s vibe to it. I'm mostly referring to the Amen breaks everyone liked to use back in the day. Still, it fits the game like a glove. This will be the last comparison, I promise, but the music also really reminds me of Deus Ex and Thief. The soundtrack doesn't stand out quite as well as those two games, but I think that's sort of the point. It's supposed to add depth and blend into the background. You know what doesn't blend into the background?
Flashbang. Suspect in sight.
This game can go from quiet to loud at the drop of a hat, and it usually happens when you breach a room. It's not uncommon for there to be a dozen or so voice lines and sound effects happening at the same time when you clear a room.
Element has moved out of visual contact.
This is about the time you'll notice the color-coded captions, and you'll be thankful for them. Sometimes you'll have to rely on your teammates' callouts, and it'll be impossible to decipher what they're saying in this soup of sound. Sometimes the captions will even move faster than me through a school zone, so it's a good idea to keep an eye on them in case your teammates actually say something important. In general, the AI is fairly competent, if not a bit overzealous, but between death and a slap on the wrist, I'd take the latter. If they're not getting stuck on terrain or ignoring orders, the AI will usually have your back, though I do want to remind you that this is modded. Elite Force tweaks a lot of the AI behavior, and that includes your team. How successful you are in this game depends on how well you can utilize your team, assuming you're playing single player at least. There is multiplayer, but I'll get into that later. Running and gunning without using your team is a very good way to get yourself killed quickly. Even if you did survive, on certain difficulties there's a pretty good chance that you would just fail the mission anyway. Why is that? Well, you're SWAT, which means you have certain rules of engagement you have to follow. There are certain police procedures you have to comply with, and not following these means you cannot get some points or even lose points at the end. Essentially, this all means that the game prioritizes keeping everyone, including armed suspects, alive and unharmed. Arresting suspects will get you the most points, but killing or incapacitating them will get you less points. Violating the rules of engagement, such as attacking without warning or attacking someone trying to surrender, will actively subtract points from your total. These rules can be pretty murky, and a lot can happen during a firefight, so it's in your advantage to try and take the enemy by surprise. And by surprise, I don't mean going in with a silenced weapon and assassinating all the suspects. Apparently, shooting restrained suspects is immoral and illegal. That's okay. I'm performing a service, and it's not something everyone can appreciate in the moment. Fun fact, did you know that after arresting the leader of a certain cult compound in an apartment complex, punching him while he's restrained will not subtract from your final score? Justifiable police brutality aside, let's get back on track. So what do I mean by surprise? Well, what I really mean is disorient the enemy before he has the chance to fight back, and you have a few tools at your disposal for this. The tools you'll need to bring depend heavily on the enemies you're facing, and what kind of equipment they're packing. This is where the pre-mission briefing comes in handy. It'll give you a pretty solid idea of what kind of enemies you'll be facing. Early game enemies might not take much more than a punch to the face, whereas late game enemies will start executing hostages if you give them too much of a head start. Of course, the best way to avoid this situation is to make sure the enemy can't even take action in the first place. This brings us to the equipment, and we'll start with the most basic element of your equipment, your gun. There are several different flavors of gun, and basically all of them are pretty good, but the main thing you want to check is what kind of ammo you bring. If there's one thing you pay attention to during the briefing, it should be the likelihood of the enemy wearing armor. What ammo type you pick will directly impact your damage output, depending on what the enemy is wearing. Of course, Elite Force added a couple extra ammo types for people who like to pick the standard cart in Mario Kart Wii. You can also change how many magazines you carry and what kind of armor you're wearing, with their associated benefits and drawbacks. You can get away with carrying a couple of magazines, and there are some missions where you won't even have to fire a shot, though this is usually because your teammates are killing everyone for you. There are some non-lethal options for the masochists out there, though I find that giving a couple of my officers some pepper spray will usually solve any non-lethal quandaries I have. Speaking of the other officers, you can also change their loadouts, and it's a good idea to diversify the tactical equipment they bring in. You won't always know the situation going in, and sometimes using something like flashbang would be considered hazardous for your health. That's not to say flashbangs are useless. In fact, they're a pretty safe tool to use when you're breaching a room. They're not very effective in certain rooms though, as the flashbangs themselves have a limited range and don't work around corners. CS gas can surpass these limitations, and it usually hangs around the area for a while as well. They can be risky to use if the enemy is wearing gas masks, and of course the grenades are useless if your team doesn't also have gas masks, unless of course you're a fan of harming your teammates. Unfortunately, using the gas mask will make you vulnerable to flashbangs and getting shot in the head. Elite Force did add a helmet that would make you immune to gas and flashbangs at the cost of your vision. As for stingers, I don't have an opinion on them because I never use them. There's also plenty of tools that help you control doors, and you would be wise to learn how to use these. The core gameplay is pretty simple. You command your team and try to clear an area as fast and as safe as you can. Missions will usually boil down to this formula. Take care of all the suspects, save all the civilians, and complete a couple of side objectives. Sometimes these can be increasingly important.
TOC, this is entry team. Code 996A. We found a bomb.
You'll want to find a good method that lets you effectively clear rooms with your teammates. Although in the grand scheme of things, the game doesn't really care that much if your teammates survive or not, and it is possible to solo some missions. The missions have no checkpoints, so if you aren't careful, you might end up having to do the whole thing over again, so it's a good idea to stay on your toes. Your team is your most important tool, and there are a number of ways you can use them effectively, even splitting them up and stacking commands in order to take down any room. Just don't ask them to navigate a building without a map. Aside from completing objectives, you'll also need to collect reports and gather evidence to get a higher score. If you're not actively collecting things as you clear rooms, this can be a bit of a hassle at the end of the mission. Of course, you can always just leave early and skip out on the points. Elite Force added a command that will let your team search for and secure evidence, but it's not always foolproof, and they won't report anyone in custody or down. Speaking of issuing commands, this game has a voice recognition system, and I bet you're wondering how well that works.
We also use it in ways where we can share things with our co-op friend.
Oh, hey, give me ammo.
Give partner ammo.
Sweet.
No, it's nothing like that. It's actually pretty responsive, and it's a pretty decent option if you're into LARPing as a SWAT officer or whatever. The game will even recognize certain alternate voice lines for issuing certain commands, such as taking someone into custody, though this can be hit or miss.
Stay
Zip 'em up.
down. Roger. Working on it. Don't make this harder than it has to be.
It might be in the upper tier of voice command systems, but I still prefer using the old keyboard and mouse because it's a bit more reliable. Outside of the main missions, that's pretty much it. You have a quick mission maker to randomize some of the main levels, and there's also a multiplayer plugin you can download since, you know, games by is kill. SWAT 4 is one of those classic tactical shooters that you don't really see on the market anymore. Sure, you have plenty of tactical shooters today like Arma and Squad, but none of them are really tight and focused in like this game. It's from a bygone era where Rainbow Six was the golden standard. And I mean the good Rainbow Sixes, not the one with the Rick and Morty skin. Ready or Not shows there's still a market for a game like this, and if you liked Ready or Not even a little bit, I guarantee you'll like SWAT 4. The game is always on Mongo sale on GOG for about $5, and even at its most expensive, it's $10, which is well worth it in my opinion. Thank you very much for watching my video, and I hope you enjoyed it.